Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for part 6 of our Future of Work for New England Employers series. This installment will focus on expense reimbursement for hybrid and remote employees. All participants are in listen-only mode. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature on WebEx. However, if your question is not answered during the session, our presenters will follow up with you directly in the coming days. For those of you interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Allison Silvera.
Thanks, Andy, and hi, everyone. I'm Allison Silvera. I'm here today with Patrick Bannon. We're both employment partners in Seyfarth's Boston office and spend a significant amount of our time counseling employers on and litigating wage and hour claims. Next slide, Andy. As Patrick and I were preparing for today's webinar, we were sort of talking about the why now for this expense reimbursement topic. Why is expense reimbursement still a hot topic for all of you when there's nothing new about expense reimbursement for employees and we're on the other side of the pandemic? And the answer for that is that despite both of these things being true, we're still in a place where we have very little guidance on what's required for expense reimbursement, but we're seeing more and more fallout from the pandemic, litigation on the topic, especially in states like California. And maybe even more than that, workforces are settling out into a hybrid normal and a remote normal state that's here to stay. And so consistency is key for what employers are doing across the board with respect to reimbursing employees based on the variations in your particular unique workforce. We're going to cover, next slide, Andy. We're going to cover what we see as some of the hottest areas, or topic areas, and then provide you with some suggestions on how to frame your expense reimbursement policies for the types of positions that you have in your workforce. But as Andy said at the outset, feel free to add questions in the chat as we go through. We'll do our best to answer them at the end if we have time. And if we don't get to them today, either Patrick and I or I will follow up and make sure that you get an answer to the question that you have. I'm going to start with just the legal landscape. So we'd sort of assumed at this point, by 3 years post-pandemic, we'd have more clarity and guidance around the requirements for reimbursing business expenses for remote and hybrid employees. And while we do have some clarity, really what it comes down to is that the decision over what to reimburse remains very much within the employer's purview, with one important caveat, and that is that expenses that an employee incurs that they are even arguably for the benefit of an employer cannot be reduce an employee's wages below minimum wage, federally or in Massachusetts. Wages must be paid free and clear, which means that receipt of at least minimum wage is truly money in an employee's pocket, and not money that comes with any contingencies like that someone must use it to buy their uniform or pay for gasoline or pay for professional licenses required to perform their job. And so the takeaway from that is really that if a non-exempt employee submits expenses that appear significant enough to put them below minimum wage, consider repaying them. Even if you have a policy that doesn't cover these expenses or you question whether they were reasonable and necessary business expenses, if there's a straight-face argument that the employee could make that they incurred those expenses for the benefit of the employer or for the purpose of performing their work, reimburse them, and then deal with the inappropriate expenses as potentially a disciplinary measure. And sort of caveated with that, I would tell the employee you're reimbursing them, but that it's outside the policy. You expect they won't incur it again. Refer back to the policy if you have one. And that would help you avoid being in a position where the employee incurs these expenses over and over again and is in danger of being below minimum wage, and then could argue that, well, you paid it before, you'll pay it again. So deal with it, make sure they're paid, but then deal with it as appropriate under your policy or your disciplinary procedures. One thing to keep in mind, too, is the same problem also applies for salaried employees. So expenses can't reduce a salaried employee below the minimum salary threshold for the exemptions. But it's much less likely that a salaried employee would incur an expense that could risk putting the employee below minimum wage unless it's for something significant, like a car or something that would obviously be something that you're just hopefully discussing with the employee in advance. There are a handful of states with more specific expense reimbursement requirements. States like California, Illinois have some specific language. There's only 2 of them in New England that have any type of expense reimbursement policies, and since we're focusing on New England for these micro webinars, those 2 states are New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Next slide, Andy. New Hampshire's policy is up on the screen. The types of things, there's nothing really specific about what New Hampshire requires, unless it's something that's incurred in connection with employment, same as federal law, but things like mileage for the use of an employee's personal vehicle for work purposes, the cost of fuel or maintenance on an employer-owned vehicle, the cost of fixing or replacing a laptop. Those are all the types of expenses that would be required to be reimbursed in New Hampshire. But on the other hand, expenses that are specifically for the benefit of the employee, like mileage for a regular commute, generally would not be reimbursed. And one key to New Hampshire's statute that's not up on the screen is timing. The statute requires that the expenses are reimbursed within 30 days of presenting the expense for reimbursement to the employer. So there's a 30-day timeline around reimbursing of expenses that you should be aware of if you have employees in New Hampshire. In Massachusetts, there was some pre-pandemic, it dates back to sort of 2013, appellate court law about not being able to shift ordinary business costs onto an employee. So for example, in Massachusetts, you can't deduct the cost of uniforms from an employee's wages. And like under federal law, you can't pay an employee less than state minimum wage. So if the employee incurs expenses that are even arguably for the benefit of the business and the amount they pay would reduce them below minimum wage, same guidance with respect to reimbursing it. In 2020, though, the Attorney General's office, this was sort of late 2020, there's no formal or written guidance that confirms this, but there was a webinar that was done by the Attorney General's office where they provided informal guidance. And what they said is that employers should assess whether an expense is unavoidable and necessary for the employee to perform job responsibilities from home. And if it is, if it fits into both of those categories, it should be reimbursed. Next slide. So then the question, of course, is what is an unavoidable and necessary expense? And no surprise, there's no sort of uniform answers to these questions, which is perhaps why we don't have more concrete guidance from the Attorney General. It depends very much on the composition of your workforce, how you got to the place with your employees where you're at, with the employees working from a variety of locations. And we've put some questions up on the screen, but the real question is sort of what is unavoidable? An unavoidable expense, and how is it different from necessary, right? So unavoidable is unable to be prevented, something that's unequivocally needed to perform the job. And depending on the type of work, this could include things like a laptop, internet, a cell phone if they use it for business purposes, a chair, a desk, special software like Adobe or AutoCAD. But the question starts to become, if you offer them office space and they choose to work on a remote or hybrid schedule, and these are things that you provide to employees who are working in your office, are those expenses actually unavoidable? If you're giving the employee the space to do it and they're choosing to work from a different location, you might be able to argue that those were avoidable expenses. But then also, they also have to be necessary. So again, what's necessary? Internet, cell phone, laptop, probably all necessary. But for internet and cell phone, who most employees are likely on a flat sort of monthly service plan, even in California, what's reimbursable is the percentage of that bill that's reasonably used for work-related purposes. So not the whole bill, not your whole family's cell phone bills, because you might use your cell phone 50% of the time for work purposes. And also consider sort of what are you providing as opposed to what you would be reimbursing. So is it less expensive if you provide an employee with things like laptops or cell phones rather than having them go and purchase their own, support their own? And then things like paper, printer, notebooks, postage, a headset for call center employees, a ring light for Zoom calls, all these things that we see employees are looking to be reimbursed for. They're claiming they're necessary to perform their job, but is a standing desk really necessary? Is an ergonomically correct chair really necessary? And they're likely nice to have things, and things that you may want to have flexibility to reimburse on occasion for employees on a one-time cost basis for employees. But there are going to be arguments you can make. Then the question that you should be looking at as you're thinking about whether an expense is reimbursable in Massachusetts is, does it fit into both of these two categories? Some things may be likely nice to have. but not necessary. And if you can make a straight-faced argument they're not necessary, then consider that as you're fleshing out your policies regarding what you're going to reimburse for expenses. And the overall takeaway from all of this law is that you should be clear what you want to reimburse as a matter of policy, but also be flexible. So especially in Massachusetts with these two caveats, if an employee takes the position that something is unavoidable and necessary, for example, because of a medical condition, you might consider whether you would provide it to them as a reasonable accommodation in the circumstances, even if it falls outside of your policy. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Patrick.
Thanks, Allison. One of the questions, let me start by reading the CLE code. The CLE code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 6558. One of the questions that we're asked about a lot regarding expenses is whether employers are required to reimburse hybrid or remote employees for expenses incurred driving to the regular office or driving to some other work location from home. So I'd like to do a bit of a deep dive on that, and then secondly, close with some practical options, suggestions, considerations for the folks on this call. And we're trying to move fast. We've made this a micro webinar, so it's a half an hour. There's a lot to talk about here. So I'll try to just cruise through it while still hopefully covering it in some substantive detail. In Massachusetts, we have the benefit of regulations regarding travel expenses, or what the regulations call transportation expenses. It's the only place where there's a statute or a regulation in Massachusetts dealing with this topic at all. So I've put those regulations up on the screen in full. They're issued by an agency called the Department of Labor Standards. And they say the short version, one of them says that if you have to travel to a work location that's not your usual work location, and it takes longer than your ordinary commute, then you have to get reimbursed for that, for the expenses of doing that. And the other one says if you have to travel from one work location to another during the workday, you have to be reimbursed for the expenses of doing that. The practical advice and the advice most employers will want to follow is pretty simple. Massachusetts employees who have travel expenses, you want to reimburse them for the travel expenses. There are a couple of litigators' points, though, for people who might be facing an issue on this or want to dive a little deeper. And boy, with all these people on a call, what better place to solicit someone who might want to challenge the law a little bit? So I'll make two litigator points. One is that these regulations apply to most employees, but not all. Certain outside sales employees are exempt from the regulations, and certain professional employees, probably coextensive with the professional employee exemption to the Fair Labor Standards Act, for those of you who know that law. But certain professional employees are exempt from these regulations, just because these regulations are interpreting a particular statute, and not all employees are covered by the statute. Secondly, and getting a little bit more maybe optimistic or making an argument that is a little bit riskier. These regulations are interpreting the minimum fair wage law in Massachusetts, and that's a law that requires a minimum wage, as you would expect. So there may be an argument for a brave employer out there that these regulations are really only intended to protect the minimum wage. They're not intended to require that any travel expenses be reimbursed to any employee, no matter what, no matter how much they're paid, no matter what the contract with the employee was. And the reasons for that are twofold. One, this is an interpretation of a statute that only has to do with minimum wage and overtime. So if someone's an exempt, really highly paid employee, what does that statute have to say about them? Arguably nothing. So what do the regulations have to say about them? Arguably nothing. But that, I warn, that's a little bit of it's a dangerous argument and goes against conventional wisdom, and you'd have to be brave to make it. And the second argument is best encapsulated on the next slide, if you would turn there, Andy. And this is what sort of drives me crazy about the idea that it's against the law not to reimburse expenses, no matter what, even if it's just a particular type of expenses. I put up here two types of contracts, and I just sort of imagine situation where someone comes in and you say, all right, you put two contracts on a table and you say, you can sign whichever one you want, and that will be your terms of employment. We can pay you a salary of $60,000 a year and the usual benefits, and we'll reimburse you your travel expenses down to the exact mile and to every drop of gasoline or every volt of electricity in your car. Or contract two, right next to it, sign whichever one you want. We'll pay you $600,000 a year instead of $60,000 a year. Normal benefits, but you're going to have to bear your own travel expenses because we're draconian employers looking to abuse our employees. So sign whichever contract you want. It's just hard for me to believe that on the right facts, an employer that had an employee sign contract B and get paid really a lot with some kind of a clear understanding that the expenses would be the employee's problem. It's hard to believe that that is certainly going to be found to be a violation of Massachusetts law. But sometimes I find decisions by courts hard to believe and hard to understand, and I don't get to write them. So this is an argument for the brave. Okay, so back to the world of practical. I couldn't resist making those points, but back to the world of the practical, which is probably what people are more concerned about, and I want to keep moving. So next slide, please. I'd like to do a little bit of a deep dive into distinguishing commuting expenses from travel expenses, because that's really the nub of it for a lot of employers. You have people who are at home all the time or some of the time, and then the question is when they do have to go to a meeting or they do have to come into the office or they do have to go to a client's site, are you required to reimburse them for their gas or for their mileage or for other expenses along the way? Pre-pandemic, people didn't work from home nearly as much, and people sort of just assumed that that was a commute and probably didn't reimburse it very much. But it actually isn't super easy to tell the difference between commuting and travel expenses when you have employees who work from home some of the time or all of the time. So the real answer is no one really knows exactly where that line is drawn. That's at least I don't, and I'll say that Allison doesn't either. But here's how we try to think about it, and this might be helpful to people. I also tried to create a chart with every possible scenario of working from home by choice hybrid, working from home by choice fully remote, asked to go to the office for a meeting by the employer, going to the office for the employee's convenience. It turned out there are something like 25 different permutations. That was just too much to try to cover, and we didn't know the answer to many of them. So I've satisfied myself with a couple of questions that are helpful in answering helping you come to the right answer, hopefully, and then in a few minutes, some of the more common scenarios. The first question is, what's different between what the employee is doing and a regular commute? If it's a regular commute, then you don't have to reimburse the expenses. Everybody's clear about that. So what are they doing that's different from that? Is it because they worked from home for a while and now they're coming into the office in the middle of the day instead of at the beginning of the day, or coming home at the end of the day? Is it that they're traveling to a different location where it's a much longer commute? Or is it that they don't normally have any commute? So you want to first, I think, identify what's different between this travel and a regular commute. And then step two is, for each difference, try to identify, is that something that is benefiting the employee? Is that something that the employee wants, that the employee has chosen? Or is that something that's benefiting the employer and the employer has pressured or required the employee to do? Or is it a combination of both? If it's clearly just because the employee wants it, and the employee could at any point stop doing it and doesn't have to do it, then I think there's a pretty good argument that it's not a business travel expense, that it's commuting with changes that the employee freely chose because that made the employee's life easier and happier, no benefit to the employer. That's not something that would have to be reimbursed, I wouldn't think. But sometimes it's not so simple who's benefiting. For example, if people are hybrid or remote, and the employer has, as a result, decreased its footprint, let go 2 floors in its office building and now has, half of the office space that it used to have, and that's going to continue for a long time. There's a risk that a judge is going to say, well, wait a minute, this isn't just for the convenience of the employee. This is also saving the company a lot of money. You've taken your real estate costs and you've shifted half of those to your workforce, and now they have to drive to get in to meet with other people when before they could have walked down the hall. So you're both benefiting, and then who knows whether they're going to find that it's a business travel expense or not. So you want to consider the non-obvious benefits to the employer. And then I guess one last point in answering that second question is you probably don't want to drink too much of your own Kool-Aid. This is an area where if we're wrong, arguably there's a claim for wages, which under Massachusetts law, as everyone knows, is a claim potentially for triple damages, and a claim where most judges are going to be more sympathetic to the employee than the big bad company. So it's not a place to make without thinking about it, at least carefully, to make arguments that are sort of losable. You want to try to err on the side of reimbursing something that is gray or arguable, just to stay out of fights if you can. Next slide, please. I've looked at sort of 6 basic scenarios. There are a lot of others and a lot of variations on that, and we get asked these questions a lot. Sometimes it depends on the nuances of the exact situation. But here are 6, sort of standard basic fact patterns, as lawyers like to say, about commuting versus travel. And I think the first 2 are pretty easy if people want to take a minute and just flip through them. If the employee is working from home totally by choice and they drive to the office totally by choice, if it's someone who can just work wherever they want, totally up to them, then I don't think there's much of an argument that that's business travel. I think that's clearly just the employee felt like going into the office that day. And that's sort of more like a commute. And 2 is sort of the same. If the employee is working from home because the employer wanted them to, but it's totally the employee's choice to come into the office that day. They just wanted to come in to be closer to a doctor's office for an errand or something like that. Then again, it's hard to see that as a business expense. It seems more like a commute or an expense incurred by the employee's choice, or to use Allison's framework, it's an avoidable expense because the employee could just say, okay, I won't do that. So then they start to get a little bit harder. If an employee is working from home by choice, but then they're called into the office by the request of the employer, I think there's still a pretty good argument that this is not an expense that has to be reimbursed, because the work from home is purely up to the employee. The employee could have been working down the hall and wouldn't have had any gas expenses at all to go to this meeting, and it's purely for their benefit to help them with whatever else is going on in their life, that they're working from home. So there's a pretty good argument here that that's avoidable. But again, as I said, watch out for arrangements that benefit both, where there might be a good argument that it is reimbursable. And then 4 is when the employee has to drive to another location. And I think if the other location is further away than their office would have been, clearly that extra mileage is going to have to be reimbursable. The hard question is, what if they didn't have a commute at all? If they're working from home and they normally have no commute because they just walk from their kitchen to their office, that's their commute. Now they have to drive to a client, and it's not their idea to drive to the client. There's that one is sort of a tough call. And then 5 and 6, I think, are cases where the duty to reimburse seems to me stronger than strong enough that most people would want to reimburse. If you're working from home because the company wanted you to, and the company summons you into the office, it's not really very different from working in the Toledo office and having to drive to the Scranton office or fly to the Scranton office. It seems like core business travel. And then if you're working from home at the employer's request and you have to drive to a client office, again, that seems like travel between 2 work locations. And the fact that one of them happens to be home shouldn't probably change anything as far as I can see it. So one of the disadvantages of webinars is it's hard to get feedback whether people are asleep or fascinated or interested in diving deeper on one of those. So I'll have to rely on, by all means, throw questions into the Q&A. We love talking about this stuff, and we'll follow up with people on specifics. But that's about as deep a dive as we have time for on commuting versus travel expenses. So Andy, if you could go on to the next slide. I want to close with some thoughts about stipends and closing thoughts. And this now is broader than just travel. It's everything. It's office equipment for a home office. It's cell phones. It's any kind of expenses that seem gray to people. One approach that in California, a lot of people have been driven to this by the rules that seem to require reimbursement of pro rata cell phone use and other expenses like that. A lot of employers have been driven to stipends where you just give the employee a guaranteed amount per month that is intended to compensate them or reimburse them for certain expenses, and they don't have to document the details each month. There are pros and cons of doing that, and as I'll talk about in a few minutes, I think done properly for the right type of employee, there are a lot of benefits. The pros are obviously saving work. It's a lot of hassle if every time someone drives into work, which could be once a week, twice a week, they calculate their mileage. Every time they buy a new printer cartridge, they've got an expense reimbursement. It's a hassle for the employee. It's a hassle for your accounting department. And sometimes if you get into prorating, I bought a new desk, and sometimes I use it for work and sometimes I don't. So I'm prorating. It's a lot of hassles to figure out exactly what really isn't always easy to figure out to the penny. So a stipend is kind of like a rough attempt at a fair guess. But there are some disadvantages to stipends. And one is that if it's too low, then you're just going to have employees claiming their actual expenses anyway, or you're going to have employees sitting there with unreimbursed expenses, which is a potential liability down the road. So it wouldn't solve the problem if you set it too low. You're just, you're giving someone a stipend, and you still have legal liability, and you still have accounting paperwork, or both. Another important disadvantage of a stipend that people should, I think, watch out for is if you're paying a stipend to an employee who is overtime eligible. If you set the stipend too high, this is a case of no good deed goes unpunished. If you were to just say $500 a month to everybody, and these are non-exempt employees, and they don't actually have anywhere near $500 a month of expenses, you're in danger of having that money not get included in their overtime rate when they get paid overtime. And you could have an overtime violation. And sooner or later, if you have a large workforce, a plaintiff's lawyer is going to stumble on that, and you're going to get a lawsuit for an overtime violation. So watch out about that. And now we are down to our last few minutes. So let's go to the practical options and suggestions. These are things that, we can't say they're advice because a lot depends on your workforce and what kind of work they're doing, what kind of expenses they have, but these are ideas you can at least think about. I do like the idea of paying a stipend for hard to calculate expenses and just be clear about what kind of expenses it does and doesn't cover. I didn't put this on the slide, I'm not sure why, but a policy is a great idea. But I think a policy that tries to answer every question, like the Internal Revenue Code tries to say whether every single type of income is taxable or not, I think that's a mistake. I think a policy should be broad and flexible. It should be to put people on notice that expenses can be reimbursed, and here's who you submit them to, but leave yourself flexibility to decide particular cases, if you can, would be my suggestion. If you're setting a stipend, document what it's based on. You might have to prove that it's fair and reasonable, and that would help you with a judge if you get sued to show that it's fair and reasonable, and it will help show that it's not just income being thrown at employees and not being included in the regular rate if it's a good, fair estimate. If you do have a stipend, I think it's almost always a good idea to have a process where people who have more expenses for strange circumstances can say, wait, I have more than the stipend. It seems only fair. If they're real expenses and they exceed the stipend, then they should be able to prove that. And I think it's important to have that process and let employees know about that process. So then if they don't use it and they come back later and said, I had more, you have that defense that you should have told us you had more and we would have reimbursed more. And again, it's common for employees to say, I didn't know I could reimburse that. And if you're in a lawsuit, you'd want to be able to prove that they were told that these expenses were reimbursable. So they can't just sue you for it. And now you have a lawsuit instead of an expense reimbursement claim. So I think if you have, for some employers at least, a stipend with a process to pay more in particular circumstances that's flexible. And you want to cast the net broadly and tell employees, bring expenses to us if you have expenses, so they can't ever claim that they didn't have any ability to get reimbursed, while still having the right to review them case by case through your accounting department to make sure that they're reasonable and necessary, timely, and all those other things. That's sort of it seems to me the best way to stay out of trouble. Keeping in mind that it's usually good, if you can, to avoid getting into fights with employees about expenses, which could be wages, which could lead to expensive legal liability. So that's about as much as we can speed into a 30-minute micro webinar. And Allison, any parting thoughts? I'll just say thank you all for attending, and happy to talk offline with anyone who wants to follow up.
Same for me. Thanks, everyone.